Chapter 8, Attitudes and Persuasive Communications. So there are three major learning objectives for this chapter. So the first one, we need to know that it is important for consumer researchers and marketers to understand the nature and power of attitudes. Second, we need to know that we form attitudes in several ways. The last one, persuasion involves an active attempt to change attitudes. So basically, it's the process of how attitude change from A to B. Now, what exactly is an attitude? An attitude is a lasting general evaluation of people, objects, places, behaviors, or ideas. So there are two key terms in this definition. First one, it is an evaluation. Okay. The second one, this evaluation can either be positive or negative. So example could be, I like Diet Coke, I really like Diet Dr. Pepper, I dislike calls from telemarketers, and so forth. Now, the attitude object, AO, is what we refer as the target of the attitude. It can be a product, a brand, the purchase of the product, the ad, and so on. It's very important that the attitude object has to be specific. Now, there are three components make up an attitude. This is what we know, or this is what we call as the ABCs: affect, behavior, and cognition. So attitude researchers traditionally assume that we learn attitudes in a fixed sequence. So first we form beliefs. This is also what we know as the cognitions. So we form cognitions or beliefs about an attitude object. Then we evaluate that object, that is affect, and then we take some action. This is behavior. So depending on the consumer's level of involvement and the circumstances, though, his attitudes can result from other hierarchies of effects as well. So a clever marketers can always change one of these three components in order to change consumers' attitudes. Now, talking about the hierarchies of effects, aka the attitude formation processes, we have five major hierarchies of effects: high involvement hierarchy, low involvement hierarchy, experiential hierarchy of effects, cognitive affective model, and independence hypothesis. So in our lecture, we are going to focus on the first three hierarchies of effects. Now let's start with the first effect. High involvement hierarchy. It starts with think, and then feel, and then do. So the high involvement hierarchy assumes that a person approaches a product decision as a problem-solving process. So first, one forms beliefs about a product as they accumulate knowledge regarding relevant attributes. And next, the individual evaluates these beliefs and forms a feeling about the product, that is affect, right? And the last, they engage in the relevant behavior. So that's the whole process of the high involvement hierarchy. Second, the low involvement hierarchy starts with think, do, and feel. So in these circumstances, think is what we know as cognition, do is behavior, and feel is affect. All right, so the low involvement hierarchy of effects assumes that the consumer initially doesn't have a strong preference for one brand over another. Instead, he or she acts on the basis of limited knowledge and forms an evaluation only after he or she has bought the product. Okay, Last effect, experiential hierarchy of effects. This effect starts with feel, do, and then think. So again, feel is affect, do is what we know as behavior, and think is cognition. So according to this effect, we act on the basis of our emotional reactions. So this is a graph of the three hierarchies of effects. In high involvement hierarchy, we learn that attitude can be formed based on cognitive information processing, right? So you start with think, and that would affect your feelings. And then last step, it would change your behavior. And in low involvement hierarchy, the attitude is based on behavioral learning processes. So you start with think, and then do, and then feel. So in this effect, we usually have to buy the product first, right? And then in experiential hierarchy, the attitude is based on hedonic consumption, or we act on the basis of our emotional reactions. Now think about a decision you made following the three learning hierarchies. Think, feel, do, that's the high involvement hierarchy. Think, do, feel, that's the low involvement hierarchy. And the feel, do, think, that's the experiential hierarchy. Okay, think about any situation that you made following the three learning hierarchies. Now, the power of attitudes. People use the term attitude in so many different ways. But for our purposes, an attitude is a lasting general evaluation of people, objects, advertisement, or issues. Consumers have attitudes towards a wide range of attitude objects, from product-specific behaviors to more general consumption-related behaviors. Okay, there are 4 different functions of attitudes. Let's start with the first one, utilitarian function. So the utilitarian function relates to the basic principles of reward and punishment. So basically, we will prefer to do something if we are more likely to get reward, and avoid to do something in order to avoid punishment. So the value, and the second one, the value expressive function, states that the attitudes that perform a value expressive function relate to the consumer's self-concept and central values. So a person forms a product attitude in this case because of what the product says about him or her as a person. Now the third one, ego defensive function. Attitudes we form to protect ourselves either from external threats or internal feelings perform an ego defensive function. Now the last function, knowledge function. So we form some attitudes because we need order, structure, or meaning. A knowledge function applies when a person is in an ambiguous situation or when he or she confronts a new product. So these are the 4 different functions of attitudes. Now, we form an attitude in several different ways depending on the particular hierarchy of effects that operates. So all attitudes are not created equally. It is important to distinguish among different types of attitudes because not all attitudes form in the same way. And consumers vary in their commitment to an attitude. The degree to commitment relates to their level of involvement with the attitude object. The 3 levels of commitment are compliance, identification, and internalization. So let's start with compliance first. So compliance is at the lowest level of involvement. In this level, we form an attitude because it helps us to gain rewards or avoid punishment. So this attitude is superficial, right? Now, identification. Identification occurs when we form an attitude to conform to another person's or group's expectations. Last one, internalization. This is the highest level. Its deep-seated attitudes become part of our value system. So these are the 3 levels of commitment. According to the principle of cognitive consistency, we value harmony among our thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, and the need to maintain uniformity among these elements motivates us. So this desire means that if necessary, we change our thoughts, feelings, or behaviors to make them consistent with other experiences. Now, self-perception theory provides an alternative explanation of dissonance effects. So the theory states that we maintain consistency as we infer that we must have a positive attitude toward an object if we have already bought or consumed it. So self-perception theory helps to explain the effectiveness of a strategy. The salespeople usually call it the foot in the door technique. So they know that consumers are more likely to comply with a big request if they agree to a smaller one first. So that's the foot in the door technique. Now, low ball technique is when a person is asked for a smaller favor and is informed after agreeing to it, and it will be very costly. A door in the face technique is when a person is first asked to do something extreme, which of course he refuses, and then asked him to do something smaller. So these are the 3 different techniques that salespeople usually do according to the self-perception theory. So the social judgment theory states that we assimilate new information about attitude objects in light of what we already know or feel. The initial attitude acts like a frame of reference, and we categorize new information in light of this standard. So people do differ in terms of what information they find acceptable. They form what is known as latitudes of acceptance and rejection around the attitude standard. So ideas that fall within the latitude are deemed favorable, but others are not. So messages that fall within the latitudes are deemed consistent, even if they are not. So this is known as an assimilation effect. Well, however, those that fall outside our latitude of acceptance are rejected, even if they are not that different. So this is what we know as a contrast effect. Now, balance theory considers how people perceive relations among different attitude objects and how they alter their attitudes so that these remain consistent or balanced. So balance theory perspective involves relations among 3 different elements. So we call the resulting attitude structure triads. So each triad contains 1, a person and his or her perceptions of an attitude object, and 3rd, some other person or object, right? So we link elements together in one of the 2 ways. They can have either a unit relation where we think a person is somehow connected to an attitude object, or they can have a sentiment relation where a person expresses liking or disliking for an attitude object. So this balancing act is the basis of celebrity endorsements, in which marketers hope that the store's popularity will transfer to the product, or when a nonprofit organization recruits a celebrity to discourage harmful behaviors. Now, to see how balance theory works, consider this scenario. Christine would like to date Dan, who is in her consumer behavior class, and in balance theory terms, Christine has a positive sentiment relation with Dan. And one day, Dan shows up in class wearing an earring, so Dan has a positive unit relation with the earring. Now, men who wear earrings are a turnoff to Christine, so she has a negative sentiment relation with men's earring. According to balance theory, Christine faces an unbalanced triad. As this figure shows, she will experience a pressure to restore balance by altering some aspect of the triad. So she will either stop shows interest, she will stop have interest in dating Dan, right? First option. Second option, she would change her beliefs that man is okay with wearing earrings. And the last option is that if she can persuade Dan to stop wearing earrings, right? So that is also a balanced status. Now, because attitudes are so complex, marketing researchers may use multi-attribute attitude models to understand them. So this type of model assumes that consumers' attitude toward an attitude object depends on the beliefs they have about several of its attributes. So the basic multi-attribute models contain 3 specific elements. So first one is attributes, beliefs, and then importance weights. So attributes. Attributes are characteristics of the attitude object. So a researcher tries to identify the attributes that most consumers use when they evaluate the object. Okay. Beliefs. Beliefs are cognitions about the specific attitude object. A belief measure assesses the extent to which the consumer perceives that a brand possesses a particular attribute. Now, last element, the importance weights. The importance weights reflect the relative priority of an attribute to the consumer. Although people might consider an attitude object on a number of attributes, some attributes are likely to be more important than others. So furthermore, these weights are likely to differ across consumers. So the most influential multi-attribute model is called the Fishbone model, which is named after its primary developer. The model measures 3 components of attitudes. Salient beliefs. So salient beliefs people have about an object attitude. So for example, these beliefs about the object a person considers during the evaluation. The second component is called object attribute linkages. Okay, or the probability that a particular object has an important attribute. Last one, evaluation of each of the important attributes. So when we combine these 3 elements, we compute a consumer's overall attitude toward an object. So you can see this equation in the lower right. So your attitude is equal to the summation of your beliefs times the evaluation. So if prospective consumers viewed one brand as superior, a marketer could try to convince the consumer that a particular attribute is important. A marketer might discover that consumers do not acquire his brand with a certain attribute. So a communications campaign can be used to strengthen the linkage. Marketers can encourage consumers to add a new attribute when new features are developed for products. And finally, one can decrease the competitors' high ratings with comparative advertising, so which they can do to influence competitors' ratings. So these are the 4 major marketing applications of the multi-attribute model. So persuasion, what is persuasion? It is an active attempt to change attitudes from time 0 to time 1. So this is, of course, job number 1 for many marketing communicators, right? We want to change people's perspective in order for them to make the purchase or ended up liking the brand. So marketers try to persuade consumers, and these persuasion attempts are based on basic psychological principles. So there are 6 approaches to persuasion as shown in the slide. So first is called reciprocity, so which means that we are more likely to give if we first receive. Scarcity means that people tend to find things that are not readily available more desirable. Authority means that we tend to believe authoritative sources. Consistency means that we try not to contradict of what we've said before. Liking means that we will agree with those we like or admire. Consensus means that we will consider what others do before we decide what to do. So these are the 6 approaches to persuasion. So the communication model specifies the 5 elements marketers need to control in order to communicate with the customers. All right, so here, if you switch to the next slide, here is the figure of this model. So the source is where the communication originates. And then it goes to message. There are many ways to say something, and the structure of the message has a significant effect on how we perceive it. And then we transmit the message via a medium, and all the receivers, or aka what we know as consumers, we interpret the message. So the source, the last step, the source receives feedback so that the marketers can use receivers' reaction to modify aspects of the message as necessary. So this is the figure of communication model. Now, this figure shows an updated model which accounts for the new developments like social media that now affect the communications process. So the traditional communications model doesn't tell the whole stories anymore, especially in today's dynamic world of interactivity, where consumers have many more choices available to them and greater control over which messages they choose to process. So in this updated communications model, you can see that receivers or the customers, they have a channel among each other, and they can communicate or sending feedbacks among receivers. Now, the updated communication model accounts for many new forms of messages that have arisen as social media has developed. So here is the new concept, m-commerce. M stands for mobile, okay? Mobile commerce is defined as the marketers promote goods and services via wireless devices. And here are some new social media platforms, Instagram, Twitter, podcasts, blogs, vlogs, etc. Now we talked about this in the previous slides that the source is where the communication originates. Here are some key concepts that you need to know about the source. So first, let's talk about source credibility. Source credibility refers to a communicator's expertise, objectivity, or trustworthiness. A credible source is particularly persuasive when the consumer has yet to learn much about a product or form an opinion about it. So there are some subtle cues such as disclaimers or fake news may reduce the source credibility. And now sleeper effect. A sleeper effect is said to occur when people over time forget the negativity associated with a particular information source and change their attitudes to align with that advocated by the source. Native advertising occurs when digital messages are designed to blend into the editorial content of the publications in which they appeal. Knowledge bias. Knowledge bias implies that a source knowledge about a topic is not accurate. So reporting bias occurs when the source has the required knowledge, but we question their willingness to convey it accurately. So that's reporting bias. Source attractiveness refers to the social value recipients attribute to a communicator. So this value relates to a person's physical appearance, personality, social status, or similarity to the receiver. We talked about halo effects and spokes characters and source attractiveness in the previous, I think in last chapter, so we are not going to go over these three concepts again. So if you want to know this, you can go back to the previous chapter and review that. Now, here are some very important decisions that we need to think about when it comes to the message, right? Should we use pictures or words? How often should the message be repeated, right? The frequent issues. Should it draw an explicit conclusion? Should it show both sides of the argument? Should it explicitly compare product to competitors? Should it arouse emotions? Should it be concrete or based on imaginary? So these are the 7 great questions to think about when it comes to the message. So next slide, you're gonna see a commercial. So basically, this cancer research organization basically uses the second to the last question to arouse people's emotion when they are trying to deliver the message to the audience. So this slide shows the characteristics of good and bad messages. So if you want your messages to have positive effects on the consumers, you can consider to show the convenience of use, showing the improved features, casting background, and make comparison to other products indirectly. And if you want to avoid the negative effects, don't put these 4 elements in your messages. For example, the extensive information on components, outdoor settings, a large number of on-screen characters, graphic displays. So these 4 things are the elements that we want to avoid. Now this is the graph for the 2-factor theory. So the 2-factor theory explains the fine line between familiarity and boredom. So it proposes that separate psychological processes operate when we repeatedly show an ad to a viewer. So the positive side of repetition is that it increases familiarity and reduces uncertainty about a product. So the negative side is that the boredom increases with each exposure. And at some point, the boredom is greater than the amount of reduced uncertainty, and then wear out begins. So basically, this figure illustrates this relationship, the relationship between familiarity and boredom. So again, this figure shows the two-factor theory. Now, comparative advertising refers to a message that compares two or more recognizable brands and weighs them in terms of one or more specific attributes. Although some comparative ads result in desired attitude change, they may also be lower in believability and stir up source derogation. So, for example, the consumers may doubt the credibility of a biased presentation and so on. So many brands have used advert gaming, including X, Burger King, and Mini Cooper. So the games keep the attention of players longer than typical advertising. They let the marketers target specific types of consumers. So marketers can tailor the nature of the game and the products in it to the profiles of different users. So the format gives advertisers a great deal of flexibility. And lastly, the games enable marketers to track exposure to advertising in the game. Now, the elaboration likelihood model, aka ELM, assumes that under conditions of high involvement, we take the central route to persuasion, and under conditions of low involvement, we take a peripheral route instead. So I'm going to talk about these two different routes separately. So the central route to persuasion. According to the ELM, when we find the information in a persuasive message relevant or interesting, we pay careful attention to it. So in this event, we focus on the arguments the marketer presents and generate cognitive responses to this content. The peripheral route to persuasion highlights the paradox of low involvement. So when we don't care as much about a product, the way how it's presented increases in the importance. So in other words, the peripheral route focuses on other cues to decide how to react to the message. Now, chapter summaries. Attitudes are very powerful and they're formed in several ways. People try to maintain consistency among their attitudinal components and their attitudes and behaviors. The communication model includes several important components which can be influenced by marketers to enhance the persuasiveness of the message. And we've also talked about the communications model identifies several important components for marketers when they try to change consumers' attitudes toward products, services, or brands. The consumer who processes such a message is not necessarily the passive receiver of the information marketers once believed him to be. Now, this is the last part of the chapter summary. Several factors influence a message source effectiveness. The way a marketer structures his message determines how persuasive it can be and it will be. Audience characteristics help to determine whether the nature of source of the message itself will be relatively more effective. So that's it for chapter 8. If you have any questions regarding to any content of this chapter, feel free to reach out to me through email. Good luck with studying.